Well, good morning, science students. This week we're going to be learning about the human respiratory system, which is the system that takes oxygen from the atmosphere and sends it to the rest of your body so you can use it, and takes carbon dioxide from your body and returns it to the atmosphere so you can get rid of it. Of course, it works in profound coordination with your cardiovascular system. From last week, you'll remember, blood coming back from the body enters the right atrium, then goes through a valve to your right ventricle, which then sends it to the lungs. And in the lungs, the blood releases all the carbon dioxide that it collected from your cells, your trillions of cells. You breathe that out. When you inhale, your lungs get a lot of oxygen, which is absorbed into your bloodstream. And then from the lungs, the blood goes into your left atrium, your left ventricle, and then out to the body. So it's easy to understand that if your respiratory system isn't functioning properly, you're in trouble. Of course, you're very familiar with all sorts of diseases and problems with the respiratory system, not least of which, of course, is the COVID-19 that we've all been talking and thinking about non-stop for the past couple of months. But there's also flu and emphysema and all kinds of stuff. And so first, let's talk about all the parts of the system, right? The path that air takes into your body starts with, of course, your nose and your mouth. Your nose is actually designed to do a couple of things. It warms cold air on the way in so your body doesn't lose a lot of heat to cold air when it's not, 90 degrees outside. And the air passes through your nose, including a lot of nose hairs and mucus that's designed to actually catch a lot of germs. After your nose and mouth, the very next stop is this area in the back of your throat called the pharynx. All right? The pharynx is the spot where your breathing and your swallowing tubes are both in the same area. And humans have an almost unique problem. Unlike almost any other animals, humans frequently choke to death because we have a habit of talking while we're eating and drinking. One thing that doesn't happen to your dog when it's eating out of the dog dish, it doesn't try to talk to you at the same time. But humans love to talk while they're dining. And so we have this peculiar situation where we often create this problem for ourselves. So the pharynx is that little area where both the breathing tube and the eating tube are in the same spot. After the pharynx, it goes in two directions. The eating tube is the esophagus and leads to your stomach. The breathing tube then goes through your voice box, otherwise known as your larynx. So we have two words that are very similar, pharynx and larynx. And one way you can keep them separate in your head is to remind yourself that if you lose your voice, that's called laryngitis, right? If you have a sore throat, that's called pharyngitis, just nobody ever calls it that. So the larynx is your voice box. Your larynx is what gives pitch to your voice. If you hold where your Adam's apple is, and girls, you have an Adam's apple too, it's just very small. If you rest your fingers on it and talk or go me, ma, moo, moo, you can feel it vibrating. And those are little muscles called your vocal cords. And those vibrate to give you the note of your speech. So your speech is in two parts, really. Your teeth, tongue, and lips provide you your consonants. B, k, d, t. That all happens up here. But the musical note of your voice, your high or low pitch, is from your larynx. So, sing My Country 'Tis of Thee with your fingers on your larynx and you can feel the vibration. Then whisper it, My country 'tis of thee. And you'll see that your larynx doesn't vibrate at all. So when a person gets laryngitis, they can still speak. It's just in a whisper, right? All right. So, nose and mouth, pharynx, larynx. From the larynx, the air goes down the windpipe, which is called the trachea. And the trachea is this series of cartilage rings down here. You can feel it through your skin. It's like the flexible part of a bendy straw. It's a bunch of rings of cartilage that are flexible. And they're there to make sure your throat doesn't just collapse like a paper drinking straw when you bend your neck. Okay, so your trachea is a very firm round tube. From the trachea, the tube splits into two to go to the right and left lung, and those tubes are called the bronchi. If you've ever had bronchitis, you will know that that's a situation where the tubes in your lungs are sore, and it hurts like thunder when you cough. And one of the problems with bronchitis is it's really hard to get rid of, because it makes you cough, and the coughing makes the tubes sore. So the bronchi keep staying sore, which keeps making you cough, which keeps them sore. So it's really tough to get rid of bronchitis. The bronchi then split further into smaller and smaller branches. That's a woodpecker. The smaller branches are called bronchioles. Just like with Italian food, you have spaghetti and spaghettini, you have bronchi and bronchioles. So it branches, just like the twigs on a tree, get smaller and smaller and smaller. The bronchi split into smaller and smaller and smaller bronchioles. And the bronchioles finally end in billions of tiny, tiny little microscopic air sacs called alveoli. One of them is called an alveolus. Plural is alveoli. The alveoli are tiny little, almost like air bubbles. And each one of those tiny little air bubbles is surrounded by a network of microscopic capillaries, which are exactly the same capillaries that we talked about in the cardiovascular system. They're tiny, tiny little blood vessels. These capillaries are bringing carbon dioxide-filled blood to the lungs. The capillaries are so thin that the CO2 can just diffuse right through them into the alveoli where you breathe it out. And at the same time, the alveoli are full of oxygen that you breathed in. And so the capillaries absorb all the oxygen, get rid of the carbon dioxide, and that's the gas exchange there. Right? Now, down low, just below your rib cage, is a curved muscle. And some of you singers or trumpet players may know that's called a diaphragm. Okay? The diaphragm is a curved muscle, and when you are in a relaxed state, it bends curved, making the space in your chest a little smaller and forces the air out of you. And when you flex the diaphragm, it straightens out, but straightens out by pulling down. And when it pulls down, it increases the volume of space in your chest, and you suck air into you like a vacuum cleaner. So inhaling is you flex that muscle and suck air down, and exhaling is you relax that muscle and air gets pushed out, which is why when you really, really try to relax, you kind of go and air comes out of you. This area right here in the bottom of your ribs where the diaphragm is, sometimes called the solar plexus. You boys may be familiar with punching your friend right there in the solar plexus to make that muscle cramp and quote-unquote knock the wind out of them. Don't do that, boys. You girls mostly don't go for punching your friends to hurt them on purpose because they think it's funny. Boys go for this. Don't do that to people on purpose. Sometimes that muscle doesn't uncramp very quickly and the person passes out because they can't breathe in. Alright, so anyway, that in a nutshell is the parts of the respiratory system. And when next I do this, we'll talk about the diseases and things that affect the respiratory system. The diseases of the respiratory system are pretty heavy duty, right? It's not the most cheerful stuff, and especially with the COVID going around, we're all scared and worried and concerned, and some of us have known people who've gotten sick, and some of you may know people that didn't make it, right? But for the same reason, it's important to talk about all that stuff. One of the main things you don't do if you want to stay healthier for the rest of your life is don't start smoking. And don't use vapes. It was only a couple of years ago when vapes became popular, and I remember telling my students then, we're only a couple years away from finding out that vapes are really bad for you. And sure enough, vapes are really bad for you. You know, it turns out breathing in a fine mist of oil is not really good for your lungs. So stay away from tobacco, stay away from vapes. And you'll preclude catching a lot of the things that can make people sick and even weaken them to the point where they can't survive other stuff like the flu. So that's it for now. And be well, and I'll talk to you again soon.